Good morning. Welcome back. We are here today on February 13th. Inside, still too cold out. But let's talk about what happened a little bit on this date. Well, first of all, in 1866, today is the day that Jesse James robbed his first bank. Okay, so his first bank, robbed on this date in 1866. He took $15,000 from the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri. And if you ever get to the Liberty, Missouri area, which is, I believe, just north of Kansas City, you can see a lot of the sites of the life and death of Jesse James. You can see where he's buried. You can see where he was killed. You can also see a lot of stuff relating to the Pony Express as well. So it's a good time. Highly recommend it. So check that out if you have the chance. But 1866, Jesse James' first bank on this date. In 1917, the Dutch dancer Mata Hari was arrested as a spy, as a German spy in Paris. And so even to this day, when we talk about a Mata Hari, we're referring to a spy in the same way we talk about a Benedict Arnold kind of thing. So, but she was arrested on this date in 1917. It was on this date in 1945 that the firebombing of Dresden took place. The firebombing of Dresden, in which 22,000 people died. And it's famous for a number of reasons, but I just want to call attention to the fact that it's the basis of a very well-known Kurt Vonnegut novel. The American writer was a prisoner of war, and they kept him in. The Germans at the time were using American prisoners as, shields. They would never bomb this area. The Allies did, and ultimately 22,000 people were killed in this firebombing of Dresden, 1945. Sadly, it was on this date in 2000 that the last original Peanuts cartoon was written, or was published. One day after the death of Charles Schulz. Okay, so Charles Schulz died on February 12th, 2000. The last cartoon was published on February 13th of 2000. That was on this date in 2000. Today's birthdays include, in 1915, the Burmese military leader Aung San was born on this date in 1915. Okay, Aung San was able to unify Burma and become its first leader after World War II. He died shortly after taking office in 1947, but not before having a daughter. And his daughter is Aung San Suu Kyi, who is currently in prison and has been in prison since a coup in Burma on February 1st of 2021. Where whatever democracy that was established there was brutally overtaken, and over the last year, there's been brutal repression by the government, by the military government, the junta that took over. But that was Aung San was born on this date in 1915. So that's the father. His daughter, she's currently in jail. She's something like 76, 77 years old. Nobel Peace Prize winner and several others. But he was born in this date in 1915. And finally, it was on this date in 1728, that Boston Puritan preacher Cotton Mather died. Cotton Mather, now he's the subject of this biography that I read many years ago, a few years ago, The Life and Times of Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather, interesting guy for a number of reasons. He was part of the well-known Mather family. There was Samuel, Increase, Cotton, Richard, Increase, Cotton, Samuel. That's it. Okay, that's the order. There were 4 generations of the Mather family. They're all preachers, all very effective in their ministries, Puritan, Congregationalists. And Cotton Mather was the third in that line, and was a very educated, very intelligent person, and really wanted to be accepted in the scientific community. One of his great contributions to mankind was that he was a very strong proponent of the smallpox vaccine. And I know this is going to come as a shock, but a lot of people in the church were not buying into the idea that a vaccine could work. Where Mather was writing, and some have argued that his most significant writing was a pamphlet he did in support of the smallpox vaccine. Interestingly enough, Ben Franklin, the American, famous American probably the most famous American of the 18th century, got his career start making fun of Cotton Mather. His very first cartoon that he ever printed, because again, Franklin got his career, made his career and made his money, made his fortune as a printer, which was like a publisher kind of that day. But the very first thing that he ever published was a cartoon making fun of Cotton Mather. And so that was it. He died on this date in 1728. Now, I should say that the other thing that Cotton Mather is well known for is that he had a role, and it's argued as far as how significant a role it was, in the Salem witch trials of the late 17th century. I mean, his father, Increase Mather, had a role kind of in a thing. So Cotton Mather had dealt with what he called an exorcism in witches and all a few years prior, and had written about it, and his book became a template for how the Salem witch trials were interpreted. So the Salem witch experience, let's call it that, was interpreted. So in that way, he's considered to have had a big a significant role, if nothing else, at least in an influential kind of way. But whatever. Cotton Mather died on this date in 1728. All right. Well, let's get back to talking about Luke, the writings of Luke and Acts. Today we're going to finish up Luke chapter 4. We're going to talk about Jesus, finish the story of what happened in Nazareth, and then we're going to take Jesus to Capernaum and see what happens there. So let's get back to talking about that. Good morning. Welcome back. We're here today to continue our discussion of Luke. Last week we talked about Luke, end of Luke chapter 3, beginning of Luke chapter 4. This is the events where Jesus, we talked about the baptism, the genealogies, and then we went into Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. And after the temptation in the wilderness, Jesus goes to the synagogue at Nazareth, and that's where what happens is he walks in and he opens the scroll, finds the passage in Isaiah, and we talked about that. And our big conclusion last week was that based on the use of Isaiah 61 there, that 60-61, that it kind of gives an indication of what Luke's it doesn't kind of, it is. It's an indication of what Luke's message is. And that is that Luke is going to show how Jesus fulfills the prophecies of Isaiah 61 by preaching the kingdom to the poor, the outcast, what did he say? Freedom for prisoners, recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free. Okay, and I kind of suggested that perhaps Luke should be referred to as the gospel for the rest of us. Okay, it's the gospel for everyone. Okay, and throughout Luke, you see more than the other gospels. You see an emphasis on Jesus interrelating with normal people, with outsiders, with people that others may not want to be a part of. Okay, so we talked about that last week. Now, what happened is, Jesus, when we left, okay, so Jesus had read this passage from Isaiah 61. Then he sat down and he says, and I'm going to go, today I'm going to start in Luke 4, beginning with verse 20. So Jesus has just read the scroll, and he says, then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him. He began by saying to them, today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. Okay, and this is where we left off last week, talking about Jesus being the fulfillment of God's plan to bring Israel back to himself. Okay, and by bringing the world back, of course, he brings Israel back, and again, that's kind of, we'll kind of develop that as we go through the rest of the book of Luke. Okay, now today we're going to talk about the reaction. Okay, what did the people think about this? Now, this is Nazareth. This is Jesus' hometown. Okay, he says, all spoke well of him and were amazed at the gracious words that came from his lips. Isn't this Joseph's son? They asked. Okay, now this is an interesting little bit here. Okay, all spoke well of him. Okay, and were amazed. Okay, now this word comes up a few times here in our passage today as we go through the next couple of events. They were amazed. Okay, they marveled is how the King James put it. They're like, wow, this guy is really good. Okay, isn't this Joseph? Don't we know his family? It's kind of like, wow, it's hard to believe that somebody we know did well. And you get that. You kind of, you suddenly discover that somebody in the neighborhood went on to become very famous in one field or another field, or infamous for that matter, and it's kind of like, wow, I had no idea that they were that good. Somebody who was, played on the high school basketball team, suddenly you discover that they went on to play in the NBA, or somebody who played on the high school, your junior high baseball team went on to play, Major League Baseball. Okay. So these are amazing, the kind of things that they're just, wow, they're just amazed. We know the family. I had no idea there was this much talent in the family. Isn't this Joseph's son? They said. Okay. They all spoke well of him, and it's interesting here. And I think the point to make is the people listening are impressed. Okay, they're impressed, but they're not converted. Okay, now as someone who has spoken and preached in church services on occasion, one of the things that you don't really think about is that you go to the pastor and the preacher, pastor, preacher, whoever, for him or her to get up there and preach, a 25, 30-minute long message. Okay, that is like, usually it's many, many hours work. Okay, you don't just get up there and throw down a good passage based on, just reading the, walking up there going, I think I'm going to open a text and just start talking. Okay, although I will confess, I was in a service once years ago. Actually, it was when I was in college, where the preacher got up and he said, he said, I don't know what God is going to have for me to preach today, but let's just open the text and see. Okay, this actually happened, right? And he just opens the text and he goes, boom, literally. He just, let's read this. And then he sat there and talked for 25, 30 minutes. Okay. Now there are preachers that will do that. I've heard one. I heard this guy. Of course, the next week was interesting because the pastor got up and again, I was at like a Bible college, and the pastor got up the next Sunday and he's like, okay, all of you Bible students, don't do what our brother did this past week. He's been in the ministry for 40 years and he's a kind of a wild card. But regardless, I said all that to say, when a pastor gets up and preaches, they've put usually many hours into the study and the development of that. And then people will go through the door, shake hands with the speaker and will say things. And, oh, I really loved that. I really appreciated this. My favorite is, I enjoyed your talk. I enjoyed your talk kind of thing. It's like, and most speakers that I know of, most preachers that I know, don't really want to hear that people enjoyed their message. I'm if you enjoyed it, you enjoyed it. I get that. Really what they really want to hear is how the message changed, how their message changed your perception of something. Oh, I really learned something. I had no idea this was so important, or something like, kind of, I don't know, I'm just saying. So I'm just kind of a tips for next time you go through the preacher's line, rather than just saying, I enjoyed your talk kind of thing. That's like really disconcerting. Like, okay, what did I do? What did I spend all that time for? But I think it's fair to say here, looking at these guys, they're impressed with Jesus, but they're not converted. Okay, they're not walking away from there, headed for the kingdom because of what they heard that day. Okay, and they're not really grasping the concept of what really happened here. Okay, so this is kind of interesting. So Jesus gets this. Jesus understands. Okay, there's this. Oh yeah, that's very nice. We enjoyed your talk. Oh, that was so nice. Such a nice boy, you know. And I remember when he was only, that kind of, Jesus. So what Jesus does here is Jesus turns it. Okay, Jesus actually takes the offensive on this point. Okay, and that's an interesting point to know, that Jesus really wants to push this. All right, and so I'm going to read what he says, and then I'm going to read kind of the reaction of the crowd. And this is one of the key elements in any of the Gospels, but and that is to really understand what is actually being said. Okay, look at the reaction of the crowd. Look at the reaction of the people around him. How do the people respond? We have a tendency to just kind of look at the text or look at what was said, and we just kind of analyze it. Whereas to really understand it, you have to look at how the people responded. Okay, that's a key element here. Okay, so let me read the passage, and then we're going to go back and kind of talk about it a little bit. Okay, Jesus said to them, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.' Truly I tell you," he continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine throughout the land. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath in the region of Sidon. And there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet not one of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian." All the people in the synagogue were furious when they heard this. They got up, drove him out of the town, and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built, in order to throw him off the cliff. But he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Now, think about this. Now, they went from being amazed at his teaching to wanting to kill him. Okay, so what is it about what Jesus said here that changes the crowd so much? Now, obviously, it does point out the fickleness of crowds, okay, especially religious crowds. But what is it that Jesus says here? What is so offensive about what Jesus says? Okay, first let's look at there's three things here that he kind of gets into. Okay, first of all, he says, "Surely you will quote this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself,' and you will tell me, 'Do here in your hometown what we have heard that you did in Capernaum.'" Okay, so clearly we know just from this passage itself that Luke is picking and choosing. Okay, so there's a ministry in Capernaum, and we're going to find after this that Jesus goes back to Capernaum, but there's a ministry in Capernaum that we don't know about as far as Luke is concerned. And it's known enough that Jesus, and maybe it's whatever he did in Capernaum, and again, these are all cities around the Sea of Galilee, which is on the north part of Israel. Okay, so whatever it is that he did in Capernaum, clearly the word about it has gotten out, and so now it's like, he says, "Okay, physician, heal yourself. Do for us here. Okay, heal your own hometown. Do now. Like let us see what you did." And so then he gives a couple of examples. The first example has to do with the widow at Zarephath, which is the story about Elijah and the Elisha healing Naaman the Syrian. Okay, now what is it about these two stories that offends them so much? Well, here basically, what most scholars looking at this have come to the conclusion that what is so offensive to the Israelites here, to the Jews in this synagogue, is that both of these stories deal with non-Jewish persons. Okay, so I assure you there were many. So I'm in verse 24 here. "Truly I tell you," Jesus continued, "no prophet is accepted in his hometown. I assure you that there were many widows in Israel in Elijah's time." Okay, when the sky was shut for 3.5 years, and there was a severe famine. Yet Elijah was not sent to any of the widows in Israel, but to a widow in Zarephath, which is a Gentile area. So his point was that, in this first point, is that, there were a lot of Jews that God could have blessed through coming into contact with through coming into contact with Elijah, but instead he sends Elijah to Zarephath, which is a Gentile area. Okay? And, verse 27, there were many in Israel with leprosy in the time of Elisha the prophet, yet none of them was cleansed, only Naaman the Syrian. Again, not a Jew, okay? A Gentile. So in essence, Jesus, here Jesus is in this Gentile, he's in this Jewish area. He's in Israel. He's in the northern area of Israel. And he's surrounded by Jews. And he's saying, God has really done a lot of work. In years past, God doesn't need the Jews. In essence, he says, let me remind you of all the times God did great works in Gentile areas. Maybe I'm not going to do anything here in Nazareth because God would rather do some work in Gentile areas. Okay, God doesn't need your approval. Now remember, going back to what John the Baptist said. Okay, John the Baptist is preaching his baptism of repentance in Luke chapter 3. Luke chapter 3. And he says to it says, come out there, you brood of vipers, who told you? And John the Baptist says, don't even tell me that, don't even play the Abraham card with me. Don't even tell me that, you get a bye because you're a Jew, because you have Father Abraham. Because God can make another people for himself out of these stones. Okay? So this is kind of consistent with that story that Luke is pointing out here. Jesus talking about the fact that, listen, the Jews are God's people. There's no question about that. But God has done a lot of work through non-Jewish people and will continue to do. And as we go into Acts, we realize, wow, it really exploded as far as the work within the Jewish people. It's kind of like, and maybe you've had this experience. Maybe somebody moves into town. Okay, so this is from Illinois, and I've pretty much, for the most part, been in Illinois my whole life. Okay, there are things I like about Illinois. There are a lot of things not to like about Illinois, but I've been in Illinois my whole life. Now, suppose, for sake of discussion, somebody moved in next door to me who was from Kentucky. Okay. And every time I get together, and I like, Debbie and I get together with the couple, and it turns out that they came here to Illinois unwillingly. Maybe they were transferred and they didn't really have a whole lot of choice, okay? And they really miss Kentucky. And all they can talk about is how great Kentucky is. Every time you get together with them, all they talk about is how great Kentucky is. Illinois, Chicago's a nice city to visit, but it's no Lexington. Okay? Yeah, Illinois' got some nice parks, but it's nothing like, I don't know any parks in Kentucky. Mammoth Cave, is that, I don't know. No, that's not it. Is it? I don't know. So, it's nothing like Kentucky. Okay, yeah, the University of Illinois is a good basketball team, but it's not like, the University of Kentucky's basketball team. Okay, and every time you talk to them, all they want to talk about is how great Kentucky is. Okay, and there's all kinds of different scenarios of this, where you have this example. You've got people, like if you have a job and the company hires somebody from another company, and all they want to talk about is how great their old company was. Okay? Or, somebody comes in and joins your church, and every time, and they get recruited into being, because they get recruited into different groups or, leadership positions, and all they want to talk about is making their church like their old church. And at some point, it gets annoying. You're like, okay, if your old church, old state, old town, old job was so great, go back there. All right, you don't need to come here and dump on us. And I think to a certain extent, and I'm not putting it in a negative that Jesus was doing this in that kind of petty sort of dump on them sort of way, but I think the reaction is kind of the same. Jesus is saying, God really doesn't need the Jews here. after saying that I'm the one that is going to bring the Jews back to where God wants them to be, just don't forget, God doesn't need the Jews. Okay? He can use Gentiles. And again, this is pointing out the importance of outsiders, non-Jews. Okay? To a Jew, the ultimate outsider is a non-Jew, Gentile. Okay? So is it any surprise that suddenly the people go, we don't like him quite so much after all? Okay? And then what happens? All the people in the synagogue were furious. They got up, drove him out of town. They said, oh, yeah, you think, come here, we'll show you. All right? And now here's this story. Now there's a couple of elements about this particular little kind of, I call it a story. It's really only a couple of sentences. They drove him out of town and took him to the brow of the hill on which the town was built in order to throw him off the cliff. Now, there are some historical issues with this. There are some critics that will look at this and they'll look at Nazareth and they'll say, there's no cliff, there's no hill, there's nothing there, okay? Well, right now there might not be, okay? The idea was that for a stoning to take place, what they would do is they would throw the person off a cliff, off a hill, into a pit, something like this, and then throw stones down on him or her. Okay, so when we talk about a cliff, it doesn't have to be a cliff like the cliffs of, if any of you remember the ABC's Wide World of Sports, where they used to have the cliff diving at Acapulco kind of thing. It doesn't have to be this huge cliff or like Victoria Falls or something like that, okay? It's just enough to throw the person off so that they're below, and then you can throw rocks down on them, okay? So they take him somewhere with violent intent. They're that upset with him, okay? They take him somewhere with this violent intent. They've got that much animosity, and it says here at the end of verse 30, and all of verse 30, it says, but he walked right through the crowd and went on his way. Okay. Now, there's a couple of ways to look at this particular event. Okay. One, it's either miraculous or it's not. I lean toward the not miraculous simply because the text does not really demand that it be miraculous. Now, it could be one of those kind of deals where that the crowd just sort of, like everybody was just kind of the heat of the moment pushing him up there. And then when they got to the point where, okay, somebody's got to push him, nobody really had the guts to do it. Okay, it could be something. Now, if you want to say it's miraculous, that's fine. The text doesn't preclude that, okay, but it doesn't demand it either. So if the text doesn't demand it be miraculous, I lean toward it's not. That Jesus just in his own personality said, look, you guys, what do you think you're going to do? You're going to kill me? I'm just going to walk out. And so you just get this, like a situation where somebody with a great deal of courage just walks through the midst, and nobody really had the guts to do anything about it at that point. That's what I think happens. But it's just interesting that here Jesus is making this statement on the one hand that I am the one that is going to bring the gospel to outsiders. I am the one that's going to bring Israel back to God. I'm going to be the consolation of Israel. And yet, by the way, Israel isn't really a necessary cog in this wheel. Okay, so and again, Luke's gospel now is going to show how Jesus overall, now again there's exceptions, but overall how Jesus reaches out, how Jesus brings God's message to both Jews and outsiders. Okay, so we'll talk about that as we go along. All right, let's move on to verse 31 here. Jesus drives out an impure spirit, okay, in verse 37. Again, these are just a heading from the NIV updated. Okay, verse 31. Then he went to Capernaum. Now remember, we know he's been to Capernaum before because in the previous passage from 14 to 30, Jesus says, oh, you're going to say, do here what you did in Capernaum. So perhaps Capernaum, then it was Nazareth, then he goes back to Capernaum. And we know that Capernaum, and sometimes it's pronounced Capernaum, Capernaum is Jesus' hometown. Okay, becomes Jesus' hometown. Okay, and you can just see that through passing references later on in this gospel and in other gospel accounts. Okay, but here it says, then he went down to Capernaum, a town in Galilee, and on the Sabbath he taught the people. They were amazed at his teaching because his words had authority. Okay, they were amazed. Now, they were amazed. Okay, this is the same Greek word as back in chapter, chapter 3, still chapter 4, 422, where the people at Nazareth were amazed at what he has to say. Okay, they were amazed with his teaching, because his words had authority. Now, we don't really know exactly what that means. Okay, the best explanation is that the difference between somebody who is explaining something in a very academic way as opposed to somebody who is just dealing with something in a very authoritative way. Okay, and what I mean by that is even today, if you start looking at some of the academic writing, there's a lot of academic writing that is just unreadable, just because there's so many footnotes and references, and so says this, and so says this, and so says this, and this, and this, and this, and this, and you read through, you're reading through a page or two or three or four before you finally get a sentence that is something substantive. So-and-so was a jerk, but according to so-and-so, you just reading. Whereas Jesus' teaching was significantly different from what they traditionally, or I should say typically, were used to having. Okay, and I think that's really all, that's something about Jesus' teaching. The facts, the issues, the details, whatever it was, something about Jesus' teaching was significantly better, significantly more effective, had a much more significant impact on the hearers than what they were used to hearing. And we've all had that situation where you kind of get used to a certain person. Okay, maybe you're used to having corporate meetings, and they bring in a ringer to do the corporate meeting, or a visiting preacher, or visiting evangelist, or visiting teacher. Somebody comes in and you go, whoa, that guy's really good. Okay, that's what is happening here. Okay, so he's getting this reputation as being a very dynamic, very inspirational, very effective teacher. Okay, because he's so much different than the scribes, who just really want to build an argument, develop an argument. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, and we see this as the text goes on. Okay, verse 33. In the synagogue, there was a man possessed by a demon. Now, I think it's a very reasonable question to ask, why is a man with a demon inside the synagogue? Okay, I don't know, but I think that's a good question. All right, something about the synagogue, or something about the nature of this man, maybe it could be that the people around didn't realize that this man was possessed by a demon. Okay, we kind of get this idea that if somebody is demon possessed and he or she looks the part, that's not necessarily the case. So it could be that this was a very normal looking person, and perhaps he was that deacon on the board who was constantly causing problems. Okay, not that a deacon on the board causing problems is a demon. Okay, but I'm just saying, maybe he was just somebody who was constantly throwing things down or whatever. Maybe he wasn't really causing any trouble at all. Okay, we don't know. All we know is this guy is in the synagogue. Jesus comes in, and again, Jesus being the Son of God, God incarnate, something about that affects the demon. The demon senses it, knows that something is not right here. In the synagogue, there was a man possessed by a demon and an impure spirit. He cried at the top of his voice. He cried. This is upon Jesus' entry. Go away. What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Okay? So, Jesus walks into the synagogue. There's a man in the synagogue who may or may not be known to be possessed by a demon. I'm going to go with a not known, because that Otherwise, you got a lot more questions you got to answer. And because the text doesn't demand it one way or the other, let's go with the easier explanation, okay? So the man sees Jesus, and it's like right away he identifies Jesus. He senses something about him. He senses Jesus. And here's the important point. He correctly identifies him. Okay? He correctly identifies Jesus. What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. Now, this is interesting because you remember back in when we talked about Isaiah, that one of the favorite phrases of Isaiah to describe the work of God was work by the Holy One of Israel. Okay, kind of a similar construction here, and I think that kind of calls back to those drawing in that Isaiac kind of link there. Verse 35, "Be quiet," Jesus said sternly. "Come out of him." Then the demon threw the man down before them all and came out without injuring him. Okay. Now, this kind of, there's a couple of questions here that come to mind as I look at this particular passage. And we'll see this happen over and over again, okay, throughout this gospel account and the other gospel accounts as well. Jesus is approached comes into contact with a demonic person, and the person correctly identifies Jesus, and Jesus tells the person not to identify him. Even though the demonic person, the demon through the person, is saying the exact truth. Okay? Jesus says, don't say anything. So, I've always asked the question, why? Why doesn't he? Now, in some of the Gospels, as you look at Mark, the Mark account is much more explicit about this whole idea of a messianic secret. Okay, and I don't want to talk about that right now. But here, I think that this point, even though this guy is saying the absolute truth, this is not a truth. This is not a source that Jesus needs. Okay, Jesus doesn't need the help from Satan. He doesn't need Satan or this demon who reports to Satan. He doesn't need this demon testifying to him. Okay? Couple of things that just kind of draw to mind. I just got finished reading this book about the PTL Club. And those of us of a certain age who were around Christianity and evangelicalism in the 1980s and 90s remember the PTL Club with fondness. I'm going to call it fondness. But in this particular story, in the big picture story, there was a guy involved in a PTL Club who was like the number 2 and number 3 guy, a guy named Dortch. Okay, he had been an Assembly of God preacher, because Jim Baker was Assembly of God, and he had been an Assembly of God preacher in Illinois, again, my fair state, and he went to work for the PTL Club, and the thing about Dortch is that Dortch had a tendency to say things in a very, and the way the book puts it is that he had the skill of telling the truth in a way that deceived. So much so that people talked within the world of the PTL Club during the time that it was kind of going down in flames of being dorched. Okay, so the guy's name was Dortch, D-O-R-T-C-H, I think that's how you spell it. And they would talk about being dorched, and that is that you would ask the question of Dortch, and Dortch had given you a technically correct answer, but it misled you in terms of your conclusion. One example was that, again, there was a relationship with a woman and all that, and there was a payout of $265,000 made. And a reporter corners Dortch and asks him point blank, did the PTL Club authorize a $250,000 payment? Okay. And Dortch's reply was absolutely correct. No, the PTL Club did not authorize a $250,000 payment. And he left it there. Okay? He's technically correct because the PTL Club had authorized a $265,000 payment. So he was technically correct, but said in a way that was meant to deceive. Now, perhaps Jesus is looking at these guys and he's going, they're just going to torch me here. So I think it's really interesting that if you're a minister, can you imagine what could be a better indictment of your effect on ministry when your name is known for a way of deceiving? Just saying. Okay, just saying. But regardless, so, maybe Jesus looked at this and said, you guys are you're just going to torch me here. I don't need this help. And so very commonly you'll see whenever Jesus deals with a demon, the demon will start making noise and Jesus will say, be quiet. I don't need your help. Okay? I don't need your help. And there's all kinds of other examples you can see. If you're going to sell a car, or if you're going to offer your services, and unbeknownst to you happen to do a remodeling work at a guy who later is arrested for, crimes against humanity, even though you had done good work at this guy's house, built a kitchen, remodeled a kitchen, whatever, you don't want to do a commercial with this guy advertising, hey, listen, I may be going to prison, but so-and-so is a great plumber. Okay? Again, it just makes sense. So Jesus doesn't want this guy's help. The other question that always comes into mind, it says here that demon threw the man down before him and came out without injuring him. Now, I'm curious what this looked like. So, and what I mean by that is, I get the part about the demonic person falling to the ground, but what did the coming out look like? I mean, is there like a corporal demon that gets out, or is there just sort of is there a cloud of smoke? I don't know. The text doesn't say. The text doesn't give any hint. I'm just curious about what that is. So, whatever. Let's move on. Verse 36. And all the people were amazed. Again, there's that amaze. The people were amazed after this event. People were amazed at the synagogue in Capernaum. The people were amazed at the synagogue in Nazareth. Okay, Jesus' teaching and presence just had that effect on people. Let's see. And all the people were amazed and said to each other, what words these are? With authority and power he gives orders to impure spirits, and they come out. Okay, so again, they're talking about the authority, which is what they talked about in Nazareth. Now they see the power, and again, they're amazed. And the news about him spread throughout the surrounding area. And again, this is all around Galilee, Nazareth, this northern Israel area. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now I'm in verse 38. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Let me stop there. Okay, so they're in Capernaum, and they're at the synagogue, and now they're going to go to the home of Simon. Now, I've been to this area. Debbie and I went there in 2017 with Ray Vanderlyn, and we went to Capernaum. Okay, and so you've got the synagogue and is on, built there, and when you look at the synagogue itself, you can see a difference in the building, where you can see the older bricks versus the newer bricks. I'm going to try and put some pictures in there. The first of the pictures of the bricks, and you see the darker on the bottom is the older, and then above is the newer construction. But the home of Simon is generally considered to be very near. It's right across the street, less than 100 feet from it. Okay, and I'm just going to put a couple of random pictures in here that kind of show what this looks like, and it's a little troublesome or problematic because, as with any traditional site in Israel, somebody has built a church on top of it. But they've dug out underneath and kind of have some different pictures. And again, I'm just going to put a few pictures here from our trip, so that you can kind of see what these look like. Capernaum is a big tourist area if you're traveling to Israel. So Jesus leaves the synagogue and goes to the home of Simon. Okay, now this is the first time we've met Simon in Luke. Okay, now we learn later on that this is Simon, who is called Simon Peter, disciple, apostle. Okay, but at this point, Jesus is just going to this guy's house. Okay. And it's interesting to watch this story of Simon, because, we kind of get the idea based on other examples where Jesus walks up to somebody and says, follow me, and they go, okay, let's go. Whereas with Simon, there's several encounters before he actually drops everything and follows Jesus, which I think is kind of a reassuring, that not everybody just kind of goes, oh yeah, I'll leave everything and follow you. It takes several contexts with Jesus for Simon to reach that point. Okay. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was suffocating. Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever. Okay, now that tells us that Simon is married. Side note, in looking at disciples, again, we don't know relative ages and stuff like that, but oftentimes it's thought that Jesus' disciples were relatively young, with the exception of Simon Peter. Okay, Peter is older. We know Peter's old enough to get married, and that would explain why Peter is the voice, kind of the leader of them, because he was older. Okay, now that's speculation. I mean, it's a little bit stronger than speculation, but if you want to disagree and say that that John was the oldest or whatever, that's fine. But we know Simon is married because of this passage. Okay, so Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and who are they? Okay, is it Simon? We don't know. Just the people around Jesus, the people around Simon's mother-in-law, asked Jesus to help her. Okay, so he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. Okay, now this is just basic healing. He just rebukes the fever, and she's healed. And then she got up at once and began to wait on them. And that the verb that's translated "wait on them" comes from the same word that we get our word today, deacon, from. Okay, but she begins to wait on them. At sunset, now this is verse 40, so at sunset, this would be after the end of the Sabbath, because they would be at the synagogue and then came over there, and So again, here, this is a situation where it appears that Jesus heals again on a Sabbath, but there's no Pharisees there to make a stink about it, so it kind of goes without mention. At sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness, and laying his hands on each one, he healed them. Okay. Again, this is just a general statement that people came to Jesus. They'd heard what he had done previously. They knew about what he had done previously in Capernaum, and he's back. He just healed Simon's mother-in-law. They want him to heal, and so he's putting his hands on people. And again, the putting of hands on is not in and of itself indicative of, okay, you need to put hands on in order to heal, because Jesus heals in other times through other stories without doing that. Okay, so we don't want to get too hung up on the physical elements, but it does indicate a type of contact. The fact that Jesus would come in contact with all these sick people, okay, these outcasts, these people who are, for one reason or another, injured, hurting, in pain, sick, that Jesus was not against saying, listen, I want to be in contact with you. Okay. Moreover, demons came out of many people, shouting, you are the Son of God, but he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak because they knew he was the Messiah. Again, Jesus doesn't need the help. Okay, we kind of talked about that before. At daybreak, Jesus went to a solitary place. Okay, probably for prayer, although we don't know. Okay, again, we see throughout the gospel accounts, we see Jesus getting away for prayer. Maybe he just wants to get away. Maybe he just needs some quiet time. I don't know. But Jesus gets away. But as we also see through as we will see through the rest of the gospel accounts, whenever Jesus goes away, people realize he's gone and they start looking for him. Okay, so here come the people looking for Jesus. The people were looking for him, and when they came to see where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. Okay. Now this is interesting because we're going to see later where Jesus is going to go to other areas where they can't get rid of Jesus quick enough, especially Gennesaret or Gadarenes, that they're like, maybe you should leave. Maybe you should leave. And here they want him to stay, but Jesus says, no, I got to go. I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that is why I sent. Now, this is the first reference in Luke to the kingdom of God. And I don't want to develop the point now, but I'm just saying, whatever it is Jesus is speaking, this outreach, this completion of God's plan, as we saw in Isaiah 40 and Isaiah 60, these are all elements of the kingdom of God. Jesus' presence, the presence of the Holy Spirit, the healing, the release of the demon exorcisms, all that. These are all elements of the kingdom of God. This is what Jesus said. I am here to do this. I need to move on. I need to go to other towns, because that is why I was sent. Okay, and he kept on preaching in the synagogues of Judea. Okay, and this is despite whatever effect he's having. Okay, again, remember, when he's preaching in Nazareth, they push him out and they want to go kill him. Okay, and we'll see that he has this effect on people as we go through the other examples in this gospel. So, okay, now next week we're going to pick up in Luke chapter 5, where Jesus is going to start calling his disciples. We're going to talk about Levi healing a man with leprosy, a couple of healings, several healings, questions about fasting. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about next week. Again, thank you very much for being with me. I appreciate your time. If you have any questions, send me an email, leave a note in the YouTube, leave a note on Facebook, or corner me if you see me on the street or in Aldi or something like that. So, all right, thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you soon.